You have received a letter. It arrived on the morning of the 26th of December, 1900, and it is written in the formal hand of the Northern Lighthouse Board. You are to travel to the Flannan Isles as relief keeper for the Eilean Mòr lighthouse. The letter is brief. It does not explain why a relief is needed ahead of the usual schedule. It simply states the facts. You will sail on the 29th, weather permitting, aboard the tender Hesperus out of Breskleet. Provisions will be arranged. You are to report to Captain Harvey at the harbour no later than 7:30 in the morning. You read the letter twice, fold it carefully, and set it beside your cup of tea, which has gone cold while you were reading. Outside the window, the wind has been running steadily for 3 days. It has that particular quality that December wind has here. Not violent, exactly, but continuous, as though it has no intention of stopping. You look at the letter again. You know the Flannan Isles by reputation, the way everyone here knows them. You know that 3 men are stationed there, that the lighthouse has been operational for just over 2 years, and that the relief schedule runs like clockwork. You do not yet know the fishermen of the Outer Hebrides have names for the Flannan Isles that do not appear on any chart. The most common is the other country. Some say it in Gaelic, some in English, but the meaning is the same. The islands are real enough, 7 of them, scattered across 2 miles of sea to the west of Lewis, but the fishermen treat them as something slightly outside the ordinary category of real. They do not land there if they can help it. When they pass between the islands and the open Atlantic, some of them still let a portion of the morning's catch slip back into the water. Not all of them, not openly, but the habit persists, passed down without explanation, the way some habits are. You have heard these stories. You grew up here, or near enough, and the Flannans were always part of the landscape of things that were understood without being discussed. Lighthouse keepers, as a rule, do not believe in the things fishermen believe. They are practical men trained by a practical institution to maintain machinery in difficult conditions. You are a practical man, but you have noticed, in the years you have done this work, that there is a difference between not believing something and being entirely at ease in a place where others have seen. The Hesperus is a solid, unglamorous vessel built specifically for these waters and the work of supplying lighthouses along the western coast of Scotland. She rolls considerably in the beam sea you encounter leaving Loch Rogue, and the crossing to the Flannans takes longer than the direct distance would suggest, because Captain Harvey is reading the weather carefully and choosing his angle. He is a quiet man, Harvey, with the kind of quietness that comes from long experience rather than temperament. He has made this crossing more times than he has counted. He stands at the wheelhouse door as you clear the mouth of the loch and the open sea opens up ahead of you. And he looks at the sky in the specific way that sailors look at the sky. Not at it, exactly, but through it, as if reading what lies behind. The hold contains the usual supplies, oil for the lamp, provisions for the 3 keepers, some personal parcels, a replacement length of crane rope that was ordered 6 weeks ago. Everything is routine. The sea is manageable. The sky is low and colourless, the kind of sky that belongs to the middle of winter without being threatening. You stand at the rail as the islands begin to resolve out of the grey horizon, and the first thing you see is that Eilean Mòr appears first as a darker shape within the general darkness of the horizon. Then it rises, the cliffs revealing themselves, higher than you always expect. The lighthouse tower white against the grey rock. The island is roughly rectangular, highest at the southwestern end where the lighthouse stands, falling away to lower ground at the east where the landing is. The Hesperus approaches from the southeast, which gives you a full view of the eastern cliff face and the concrete path that climbs from the landing to the compound above. There should be a figure on that path, or on the cliff top, or at the landing itself. When a relief tender approaches Eilean Mòr, the keepers come out to meet it. This is not a courtesy. It is operational procedure. The crane on the east landing requires 2 men to operate safely, and the transfer of supplies takes at least 3. Captain Harvey sounds the horn. The sound goes across the water and strikes the cliff face and returns, flattened and strange. There is no one at the landing, no one on the path, no flag on the flagpole above the compound. The tower is there, solid and white and apparently intact. The lamp is dark. Harvey sounds the horn again. The sea receives it. The Hesperus circles Eilean Mòr at a careful distance. The sea around the island is not dangerous today. There is swell, but it is the ordinary swell of the open Atlantic, predictable and manageable. Harvey takes her around the southern end and then up the western side, and from here you can see the west landing, or rather the cliff above it. The actual platform is below the cliff edge and not visible from sea level. There is nothing on the cliff top. The grass is bending in the wind, the same as always. The lighthouse compound is visible, the main tower, the 2 flanking accommodation wings, the outbuildings, all of it in apparent order. No broken windows, no visible damage. The gate to the compound, which can sometimes be seen from this angle, is closed. Inside that compound are 3 men. James Duckett, the principal keeper, in his late 40s, 20 years of lighthouse service. Thomas Marshall, first assistant, in his mid-30s, 7 years of service. Donald MacArthur, occasional keeper, brought in 6 weeks ago to cover a regular keeper's illness. None of them appear. The Hesperus completes her circuit of the island and returns to the east side, and Harvey makes the decision. The man he sends is Joseph Moore, one of the Hesperus's crew who has made this crossing regularly and knows the east landing well. Moore goes ashore in the small boat and ties up at the base of the steps. The east landing is a concrete platform at the base of the cliff, with 83 steps cut into the rock face above it, leading up to the concrete path that runs along the cliff top to the compound. Moore climbs the steps. From the top he can see the lighthouse clearly and the path leading to it, and the compound wall and the gate. The gate is shut. He walks the path, which takes perhaps 5 minutes, and lets himself through the gate. The compound is empty. The main accommodation building, a low stone structure attached to the base of the tower, has its door shut but not locked. Moore goes inside. He moves through the rooms. The beds are made. The kitchen is clean and in order. There is food on the table, a meal that was prepared and not eaten. Its exact nature by this point unclear. A chair is overturned on the kitchen floor, one of the 3 chairs at the table. Moore notes this and moves on. He checks the oil room, the storerooms, the equipment room. He climbs the tower. The lamp room is in order, the mechanism functional, the oil reservoir adequately filled. He descends. He walks back to the gate and looks out at the path and the cliff and the sea. The lighthouse log is a large, bound volume kept in the watch room on a dedicated shelf, chained to a ring in the wall so that it cannot be removed without the chain being unlocked. This is standard practice. The log is an official document, and its security is part of the keeper's duty. Moore finds it in its place, the chain intact, the most recent entry clearly visible when he opens it to the final written pages. The log is kept with the meticulous consistency that all lighthouse logs require. Date, time, weather, observations, equipment status, anything of note. Thomas Marshall is the man who kept this log. His handwriting is recognizable throughout, regular and clear. Mòr reads the final entries. He reads them slowly, because something about them requires reading slowly. The last entry is dated the 15th of December, 11 days ago. The entries for the 12th, 13th, and 14th are longer than usual, more personal in tone, describing not just the weather and the equipment, but the men's behavior and state of mind, which is unusual. Lighthouse logs are not diaries. Mòr reads these entries twice, then lost the watchroom and goes to call. When the Hesperus first approached Eilean Mòr, the lighthouse lamp was burning. Mòr confirmed this from shore. The lamp was operational, the lens rotating, the light functioning exactly as it should. This is significant. The lamp at Eilean Mòr is an impressive mechanism, a dioptric lens nearly 6 feet in diameter, rotating on a mercury float, driven by a clockwork weight that descends slowly through the tower and must be wound up by hand every few hours. To keep that lamp burning and rotating for 11 days with no keeper present is not possible. Someone maintained it, at least until recently. When Mòr reached the lamp room, the driving weight had nearly reached the bottom of its descent. Another few hours and the mechanism would have stopped and the light would have failed. He wound it before he did anything else, before he searched the rooms, before he examined the log, before he called for Harvey. The lamp came first. He was a lighthouse keeper. That was simply the order of things. But the implication is clear enough. Whoever last wound the weight did so recently. The light was tended almost to the moment of. Mòr and Harvey searched the island together. This takes most of the afternoon, the winter light already declining by 2 o'clock and the wind picking up from the west as the day fails. They go systematically. The compound first, then the outbuildings, then the cliff-top path all the way around the island's circumference. The east landing, empty. Nothing unusual. The crane and equipment in their places. The north end, grass and rock. No shelter. Nowhere a man could be without being visible. The south end, the same. The west side, where the cliff is highest and the sea comes in hardest. They approach carefully and look down at the west landing platform from above. The platform is there. The concrete square, the iron railing, the equipment box that should be in its socket. Even from above, Mòr can see something is wrong with the railing. He makes a note to examine the west landing properly when the sea allows. They call out, at intervals, both of them, in case a man is injured somewhere and cannot walk. Their voices carry across the island and out over the water and come back changed by the distance. No one answers. By the time the light is gone, the conclusion is the same as it was when Mòr first came ashore. 3 men were stationed on this island. Read the log from the beginning of that final week, and the first entry you encounter is the 12th of December, written by Thomas Marshall in his usual hand. It is, on the surface, unremarkable. He records the weather. Westerly wind force 4, with occasional squalls moving through from the southwest. The light was exhibited at dusk, all machinery in good order. The lens was cleaned in the morning. Provisions are adequate and oil reserves sufficient for the next 3 weeks. James Duckett inspected the west landing crane in the afternoon and found the whole rope showing where at the upper block, A replacement has been ordered from the commissioners and is expected on the next relief visit. This is the kind of entry that appears in every lighthouse log every day. Functional, specific, impersonal, but there is a sentence at the end, written in a marginally lighter pressure, as if added later or with a different frame of mind. Donald MacArthur complained of the cold again. He is not suited to these postings. It is an odd sentence to include in an official document. Keepers don't typically note one another's complaints. Marshall included it. The next day's entry is where the wind increased overnight. By the morning of the 13th, Marshall records it as southwesterly at 4/7, gusting higher, with a heavy swell building from the Atlantic. This is not exceptional weather for the Flannan Isles in December. 4/7 is a near gale, uncomfortable on an exposed rock station, but well within the range of what experienced keepers manage routinely. The lamp held through the night without difficulty. The machinery is sound. These details are recorded in the usual way. But then Marshall adds something that has no precedent in the prior 2 years of this log. He writes that Duckett has been quiet all day. Just that. Duckett has been quiet. No context. No explanation of why this is noteworthy. No suggestion that Duckett's quietness is unusual per se. And then, and this is the line that investigators will return to repeatedly in the weeks and months that follow, he writes, MacArthur is praying. Nothing more. No elaboration. No editorial comment. No note about whether the praying is continuous or occasional, whether it is private or audible, whether Marshall himself finds it concerning or simply worth recording. He records it the way he records the wind speed, as a fact about the 14th of December. The storm is still building. Marshall writes that it is the worst he has witnessed in his 7 years of lighthouse service. He uses the word extraordinary twice in the same entry, which is without precedent in his logbook. The sea, he writes, is striking the western cliff with such force that the tower itself trembles. He means this literally. He can feel it through the soles of his boots, through the floor of the watch room, a vibration that comes and goes with each wave impact. The spray, he notes, is reaching the lamp room windows, which are 140 feet above sea level. He records the barometric pressure, which has dropped sharply. He records that all 3 men are in the watch room together. He records that Duckett is crying. He records that MacArthur is on his knees still. Or again, it is not clear from the syntax which. He records that the light is holding and the mechanism is functioning and the log is being maintained. And then he stops writing for the day. And somewhere in the machinery of this description there is the fact of Thomas Marshall himself, the man noting everything, recording the crying and the praying and the trembling of the tower, sitting in the watch room and writing it down. What he was feeling is not recorded. That was not the storm that Marshall describes. The storm of the 12th, 13th, and 14th of December, 1900, poses a significant problem for anyone trying to understand what happened on Eilean Mòr, because the storm, as Marshall describes it, does not appear in any other record. The weather station at Butt of Lewis, 40 miles to the northeast, recorded nothing unusual for those 3 days. The reports from the weather station at Stornoway are similarly unremarkable. Ships operating in the waters around the Outer Hebrides during that period, whose logs were examined during the subsequent investigation, noted moderate conditions, heavy swell, certainly, but nothing approaching the force 10 or above that Marshall's descriptions imply. The barometric readings he records in the log don't correspond with the regional pressure pattern. This is not to say Marshall was lying or hallucinating. It is possible that the Flannan Isles, in their particular position on the continental shelf where deep Atlantic water meets the shallower coastal waters, experienced localized conditions of unusual severity that were not replicated elsewhere. It is possible. Weather is complex, and the Flannans are genuinely exposed in ways that other stations are not. But the absence of corroborating evidence for the storm Marshall describes is one of the facts that has never been satisfied. The entry for the 15th of December is 5 words long. Marshall writes, "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. That is everything." After 3 days of the most unusual writing in the entire logbook, detailed, personal, emotionally inflected in a way that official log entries essentially never are. The final entry is 5 words and a statement of theological relief, or resignation, or something else entirely. 5 words are not enough to establish tone with any confidence. The handwriting has been examined by graphologists who are asked to compare it with the entries that precede it. Their conclusions are careful and contradictory. Some say the handwriting is consistent throughout. Others note subtle differences in the formation of certain letters, a change in pressure, a slight variation in the angle, that they describe as consistent with a different emotional state. One report uses the phrase, "written with unusual composure," as if the composure itself were the unusual thing. After the 15th, the log is blank. 11 days of blank pages between that final entry and the moment when Joseph Mòr opens the volume in the watch room and reads. The gap in the log is, in a certain sense, the most important document of all. Lighthouse logs are not optional. The commissioners of northern lighthouses require them to be kept without interruption for the entire duration of a posting. Missing entries are taken seriously. An unexplained gap in a lighthouse log is the kind of thing that results in formal inquiries, letters to the keepers involved, notations in their service records. In 2 years of operation, the Eilean Mòr log has not missed a single day. Every day from the first lighting of the lamp in December 1899 through to the 14th of December 1900. Continuous. And then the 15th. 5 words. And then nothing. The log does not record the 16th of December, or the 17th, or any of the 11 days between the 15th and the 26th, when Joseph Mòr arrived and opened it. A lighthouse log that stops mid-December without explanation is not simply an administrative irregularity. It is, as one investigator will write in his report, a statement. He does not complete the thought. He moves on to the next point. But the statement is there, in the blank pages, as clear. Mòr returns to the kitchen. He's been through it once already. Quickly, scanning for occupants, finding the overturned chair and the food on the table and moving on. Now he goes back and looks at it properly. The kitchen is a functional room, a coal range against one wall, a table in the center, 3 chairs, shelves for provisions, a rack for drying things, hooks by the door for oilskins and outer coats. Everything in the room is in the correct order except for the one overturned chair and the uneaten meal. Duckett, as principal keeper, was responsible for the overall standard of the station. His inspections were thorough and his expectations consistent. The kitchen reflects this. Every item is in its place. The surfaces are clean. The provisions are organized. The chair on the floor is the one anomaly, and its significance is hard to calibrate. A chair falls. People knock chairs over. It could mean anything or nothing, but it is the only thing in the kitchen that is not where it should be, and in a room where everything else has been maintained with care, the one wrong thing stands out. Mòr rights the chair. Then he looks at the hooks by the door. MacArthur's oilskin jacket is there. He can identify it by the initials sewn into the lining. DM Donald MacArthur. It is on its hook. The meal on the kitchen table has spoiled in 11 days, which makes its precise identification difficult. Mòr can establish that it was prepared. There is a pot on the range, utensils laid out, the table set with 3 places, 3 cups. The food itself has been prepared, but not served or not finished being served. The question of which meal it was, breakfast, dinner, supper, becomes important in the weeks that follow, because the answer shapes how we imagine the sequence of events. If it was breakfast, the men were leaving at the start of a day. If it was the evening meal, something happened at the end of one. The evidence is ambiguous. The positioning of the food is consistent with morning preparations, the porridge pot, the arrangement of the cups. But the light on the 15th of December in the Outer Hebrides goes at around 3:30 in the afternoon, and a meal prepared in the late afternoon in winter might easily look like a morning meal in its layout. What is clear is this: the meal was being made or was ready to be eaten, and all 3 men left the kitchen before eating it. They did not return. They did not clear the table. The pot stayed on the cold range. The cups stayed in their places. 3 chairs, 2 upright. The following day, when the sea has moderated enough, Mòr and 2 members of the Hesperus's crew make their way to the West Landing. This requires going back down to the East Landing by boat, rounding the south end of the island, and approaching the West Landing from the sea. The cliff path down to the West Landing from above is too steep and exposed to use in these conditions. The West Landing is the more dangerous of the 2, facing directly into the Atlantic, used primarily for heavy equipment and only in the calmest conditions. They approach it carefully and tie up at the base of the concrete steps. From sea level, looking up, you can see the damage before you have climbed a single step. The iron railing at the top of the platform, set in concrete, heavy, designed to withstand whatever the Atlantic could produce, has been bent, not snapped, not rusted, not corroded through, bent inward, away from the sea and toward the island, as though something had come over it from the outside with enormous horizontal force. The concrete around the railing posts is cracked. A rope that should be in the equipment storage box is missing. Mòr notes all of this before he has quite taken in the thing that makes the hair move on the back of his neck, which is the condition of the equipment storage box at the West Landing is a substantial iron container, bolted into a socket cut into the concrete of the platform. When empty, it weighs somewhere between 200 and 250 pounds. It is not a thing that moves on its own. The socket it sits in is designed to hold it in place, and the bolts that secure it are not merely functional. They are insurance against the worst sea conditions the engineers who built the station believed it likely to encounter. When Mòr reaches the platform and looks at where the box should be, it is not there. He finds it 30 feet up the slope, on the concrete path between the platform and the top of the cliff. It has been moved from its socket and carried or pushed 30 feet uphill and set down. Mòr examines the socket. The bolts have been sheathed. The box itself is intact, dented on 2 sides in a way that is consistent with having been struck by something. What force could do this? What force could reach a platform 65 feet above the waterline? Sheer iron bolts from their setting, bend heavy railings inward, carry away a rope, and move a 200-pound box 30 feet uphill. The official investigation will spend considerable time on this question. The answer it arrives at is a wave of exceptional and perhaps Robert Muirhead of the Northern Lighthouse Board arrives on Eilean Mòr in early January to conduct the formal investigation. He examines the West Landing, reads the log, interviews Mòr and Harvey and the Hesperus's crew, and takes careful measurements. His conclusion is submitted to the commissioners in late January and becomes the official record of what happened. The theory is this: on the 15th of December, two of the keepers, most probably Duckett and Marshall, went to the West Landing to check on equipment or assess damage following the storms of the preceding days. While they were on the platform, a wave of exceptional size, coming from the west or southwest without sufficient warning, struck the platform and swept both men into the sea. MacArthur, who may have been watching from the cliff above or from the path leading down, saw this happen and ran to assist. A second wave took him. The sequence was over in minutes, possibly seconds. The oilskin on the hook. MacArthur had no time to put it on. The overturned chair. One of the men stood up suddenly. The meal, abandoned when something called them urgently outside. This is the theory. It is coherent. It accounts for the physical evidence. Muirhead believed it. Most investigators since have accepted it. The oilskin jacket has become the most discussed single piece of evidence in the Flannan Isles disappearance, and the discussion always comes to the same impasse. The jacket belongs to Donald MacArthur. Muirhead's theory requires MacArthur to have run from the lighthouse to the West Landing, a distance of roughly 400 yards along an exposed cliff path in December, without stopping to put on his oilskin. The explanation offered is that he was responding to an emergency. That urgency overrode habit. This is possible. People do irrational things in emergencies, but lighthouse keepers are specifically trained against this kind of irrationality. The oilskin is not an optional comfort. In the conditions that prevail on the Flannan Isles in winter, leaving a building without it is a meaningful act. Your ability to function, to help, to survive exposure is materially affected. MacArthur's oilskin was on its hook by the door. The hook is inches from the door handle. The act of grabbing it would have taken 1 second, perhaps 2. Muirhead notes the oilskin in his report and addresses it briefly. He suggests that in the extreme urgency of the moment, MacArthur did not take it. This may be true, but the keepers who read the report in the years that followed, men who knew what it meant to be on an exposed cliff in December without an oilskin. What? By most accounts, the overturned chair in the kitchen is a small thing, and it is easy to explain and harder to set aside entirely. Chairs fall. People stand up quickly in moments of urgency and chairs tip backwards. It happens. In a house with 3 men in it, over the course of weeks, it happens more often than you might think. But Duckett's standard of order at the station is documented. His inspection reports from the Northern Lighthouse Board over 20 years are consistent. Equipment correctly positioned. Rooms maintained. Nothing out of place. 3 chairs around a kitchen table. Upright is the correct position for chairs around a table. A chair on the floor is wrong. Whoever moved most urgently, whoever stood up so quickly that the chair went over, did not stop to right it. This means they left the kitchen immediately. Not after finishing their meal, not after clearing up, not after a pause to consider. The chair went over, and whoever knocked it over kept moving. The kitchen remained exactly as it was. The chair on the floor, the meal on the table, the oilskin on the hook, for 11 days. Nothing disturbed it. The island had that stillness, sometimes, that you find in places where people have recently been. Joseph Moore's written account of his initial search of the lighthouse includes a detail that appears nowhere in the official investigation report. The clock in the watchroom had stopped, not wound down. It was a spring-driven clock, and Moore checked this. The spring still had tension, not damaged in any visible way, simply stopped at 9:08. Moore records this in his own handwriting in a personal account he wrote some weeks after the events, which came to light decades later in a stored-away archive. He noted the time specifically because he thought it might be relevant, might indicate, if nothing else, what time of day or night the room had last been actively used, whether something had occurred to knock the clock or stop it. He wrote it down. He presumably mentioned it to someone, to Harvey, to Muirhead, to the investigators who interviewed him. But the Muirhead report does not mention the clock. It is not fair. The detail disappears from the official record completely, and no investigator of the period appears to have followed up on it. 9:08. Whether morning or evening is not stated. Whether the date can be inferred from other evidence has been debated. Inconclusively, in the weeks following the disappearance, investigators speak with people who knew the three missing keepers. What they find is consistent and, in a way, frustrating. Consistent because the picture is clear. Frustrating because it does not help explain anything. James Duckett, 53 years old, 20 years of service, regarded as one of the most experienced and reliable principal keepers in the Northern Lighthouse Board's employ. He had served on 4 previous stations, including one other rock station of comparable difficulty. His record was impeccable. His temperament was described by colleagues as steady, undemonstrative, professional. Thomas Marshall, in his mid-30s, 7 years of service, a capable and conscientious assistant keeper. His logs from previous postings are accurate and detailed. He was known to be reserved but not difficult. Donald MacArthur, newer, less experienced. By Marshall's own account, somewhat unsuited to the isolation of rock station work. But there is no suggestion in any account that he was unstable, that his unsuitability extended to anything beyond ordinary homesickness and discomfort. 3 professional men, competent at their work, without apparent conflict between them, without any suggestion of the kind of desperation that leads men to do extreme things. 3 professional men. In 1912, the English poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a poem called Flannan Isle. It is vivid, atmospheric, and almost entirely inaccurate in its particulars. Gibson had not visited the island. He had read press accounts of the disappearance and built his poem from them, filling in the details that suited his purposes. In his version, the men vanished while eating, a pan of herrings still hot on the fire, 3 chairs pushed back from the table as if the men had simply stood up and stepped out of the world. He adds a black feather lying across the threshold, which does not appear in any investigator's account. He invents a quality of dread in the approaching crew. The poem is, by any measure, a transformation of the facts into something more resonant and less precise. But it has lasted, where many more accurate accounts have not, because it caught something true about the feeling of the case even while misrepresenting the evidence. The sense that the island itself was responsible, that the men did not so much leave as cease, that the Flannans had always been the other country, and that 3 men had, on a day in December, passed from this side of the border to the other, and the border had closed. The physics of extreme waves have been studied in detail since 1900, and the concept of the rogue wave, a single wave dramatically larger than the sea state around it, appearing without sufficient warning for those in its path, is now an accepted scientific phenomenon rather than a sailor's legend. They have been documented instrumentally. They have been recorded by ships, by ocean platforms, by satellite. The conditions that produce them are understood. Constructive interference between wave trains of similar frequency, amplified by underwater topography, convergent currents, storm remnants from thousands of miles away arriving at the same point at the same time. The Atlantic approaches to the Outer Hebrides are exactly the kind of location where these conditions can occur. The west landing at Eilean Mòr, 65 feet above sea level, is not beyond the reach of an extreme wave in the right conditions. The bent railing, the moved equipment box, the sheet bolts, all of this is consistent with a wave of perhaps 80 to 100 feet striking the platform with its full weight. And such a wave would come and go in seconds. By the time it had drawn back into the sea, there would be nothing on the platform that had not been there before. Except Marshall's log describes Duckett as quiet on the 13th and crying on the 14th. And a question that cannot be answered from these entries alone is what produced those responses. The wave theory, a wave large enough to damage the west landing platform, appearing during or after the storms of the 12th through 14th, fits the physical evidence. But does it fit the emotional evidence? James Duckett had 20 years of lighthouse service, much of it on exposed stations. He had seen severe storms. He had, presumably, seen large waves. If a wave, even a very large wave, had damaged the west landing during those 3 days, would that alone have reduced an experienced keeper of his caliber to prolonged silence and tears? It is possible. A wave large enough to bend iron railing and move a 200-pound box might reasonably produce a kind of existential shock even in an experienced man. But the log's description feels different from that. It feels like fear that has no visible object. Fear of something that is happening, or has happened, or might be about to happen, that Marshall cannot bring himself to name in an official document. Marshall writes what he sees. He doesn't speculate. And what he sees is Duckett crying, and MacArthur praying, and himself writing it down, in the watch room, at the top of the tower, while outside the sea does something he has never seen. The Flannan Isles appear in Gaelic tradition as a place apart. Travellers who accidentally landed there, blown off course, seeking shelter from weather, described experiences that they could not fully explain afterward, a sense of being watched by something that was not visible, sounds that had no apparent source, voices, sometimes, or music, or simply a noise that was not the wind and was not the sea but was not quite anything else either. A distortion of time, arriving back on the mainland uncertain whether hours or days had passed on the island. These accounts are not medieval. They come from the 17th and 18th centuries, from people who are not given to fantasy, who are fishermen and traders with practical and glamorous relationships to the sea. The accounts are not identical, but they have a family resemblance. They describe the islands as a threshold, a place where the membrane between the ordinary world and some adjacent version of it is thinner than elsewhere. The lighthouse was built on Eilean Mòr without reference to any of this, in the rational tradition of Victorian engineering. It addressed the practical problem of shipwrecks on this coast. It did not address the older question of what the islands had always been. The fishermen knew this, which is why they still left portions of their catch at the waterline. New keepers were appointed to Eilean Mòr within 3 weeks of the disappearance. The lighthouse could not remain unattended. Its light covers an approach that ships use continuously, and the winter of 1900 was not a time for extended closures of navigational aids. The men appointed knew what had happened to their predecessors. They could not be told otherwise. It had been in the newspapers by then, in brief factual reports, and the lighthouse community is small enough that information of this kind moves through it without needing a press account. The new keepers went to the island. They maintained the light. Their logs, in the weeks that follow, are unremarkable. Weather observations, equipment status, nothing unusual. If they were afraid, they did not write it down. They were lighthouse keepers, and lighthouse keepers maintain a certain professional register in their official records. But in a letter from one of the first replacement keepers to his wife, discovered in a family archive in the 1970s, he writes, "The island is very quiet, more than it should be. I do not mean the absence of the men, though their absence is present too. I mean the island itself is quiet, as if the bodies of James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were never recovered. This is not unusual in the context of men lost in these waters. The Atlantic currents around the Outer Hebrides are complex and powerful and run in directions that do not return things to the coast from which they came. The sea is very large here and very cold, and what it takes it keeps." The formal investigation was closed in the spring of 1901. The Northern Lighthouse Board updated its safety procedures. Keepers were instructed to take greater precautions at the West Landing, to always leave one man at the tower when two went outside, to signal more clearly in conditions of possible emergency. These were reasonable precautions. They acknowledged that something had gone wrong, without specifying exactly what. And then the lighthouse continued. The light kept turning, tended by different hands. The log kept being written in, day by day, unremarkably, as lighthouses are supposed to be, reliable, regular, present. Eilean Mòr itself changed nothing. The cliff was the same. The grass was the same. The west landing platform was repaired and the railing replaced and the equipment box refitted in its socket. The island held whatever it held, quietly. The watchroom at the top of the Eilean Mòr lighthouse is a circular space perhaps 15 feet across, with the lamp mechanism at its centre and windows all the way round. From here, in good visibility, you can see for 20 miles in every direction, west to the open Atlantic, east to the coastline of Lewis, north and south to open water and the shapes of the other Flannan Islands, smaller and lower and uninhabited. The lamp itself stands in the centre of the room, the great lens of ground glass turning slowly in its mercury trough, driven by its clockwork weight. When it is turning, you can hear it, a soft, continuous sound, like something breathing. The windows are thick glass, set in iron frames, and they keep out the wind almost completely. The room is quieter than you expect. Up here, below you, the island, around you, the sea, and the lamp turning, sending its beam out into the dark at regular intervals. It is a room that has been occupied continuously by rotating keepers for 26 years. Every man who stood watch here brought his own particular wakefulness to it, his own way of passing the hours. Marshall spent the night of the 14th in this room and wrote what he saw. Somewhere between then and now, the mechanics of the lamp are precise and demanding. The lens is a first-order dioptric lens, consisting of dozens of individually ground glass prisms arranged in concentric rings around a central bullseye. Light from the burner at the center is collected and focused into a horizontal beam by the prisms above and below, and refracted forward through the central panel. The lens rotates on a float of liquid mercury, which reduces friction to near zero and allows the mechanism of this weight to be turned by a relatively modest clockwork motor. The motor is driven by a weight suspended on a cable inside the lighthouse tower. The same principle as a grandfather clock, at a much larger scale. The weight descends slowly over the course of about 4 hours. When it reaches the bottom, the keeper on watch must wind it up again. This is done with a hand crank. It takes perhaps 15 minutes of moderate effort. Then the weight begins its descent again, and the lamp turns, and the beam goes out. All night, every night, the keeper winds and watches and records and wins again. There is a rhythm to it, a physical rhythm imposed by the mechanism that structures the entire night watch. Marshall wound this weight on the night of the 14th. Someone wound it some time after that. Then it was left, and it descended, and Mòr arrived just. Marshall's log entry for the 13th of December contains a sentence that has been quoted in every serious account of the disappearance and remains, after all this time, unexplained. After describing the increase in wind and the spray reaching the cliff top, he writes, "The sound is not like the sea." He does not follow this observation with any explanation or elaboration. The next sentence is about Ducat. The sentence stands alone in the entry, between descriptions of weather and descriptions of the men's behavior, with no bridge between it and what surrounds it. What does it mean for a sound to not be like the sea, when you are on a lighthouse island surrounded by sea? Marshall had 7 years of experience. He had listened to the sea in all its registers, the slap of calm water on rock, the sustained roar of force 9 wind and wave, the particular rushing of swell withdrawing through crevices in the cliff face, the thumping percussion of storm surf against a flat face of rock. He knew what the sea sounded like. He had written about the sea in his official log for 7 years. If he wrote that what he was hearing did not sound like the sea, he meant something precise by it. He did not say what it sounded like instead. He left the sentence there in the middle of his entry and moved on to the next fact. And whatever he was describing, the keeper's night watch on a lighthouse station is structured around the mechanism. The oil lamp must be checked every hour for proper burning. The weight must be wound every 4 hours. The weather must be recorded at regular intervals. Between these obligations, the keeper on watch is essentially alone with the running machinery and the sea and his own wakefulness. The watch from midnight to 4 in the morning, what some keepers call the dead watch, or the long watch, has a particular character. At midnight, the night still has substantial hours ahead of it. By 4, the night is tilting toward morning even when there is no visible evidence of it. The 3 or 4 hours between those 2 points are the hours in which wakefulness becomes effortful, in which the silence of the tower becomes very specific. Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur would have rotated watches. 3 men, 1 on duty, 2 sleeping. The pattern cycling through every night. On the 14th, Marshall records all 3 of them in the watchroom together. This was unusual, not unprecedented in bad weather, when the noise makes sleeping difficult, but unusual. 3 men in the watchroom at the same time means 2 of them were not sleeping when they should have been. Something had from the watchroom windows. If you know where to look, you can see the top of the west landing cliff. The landing itself is below the cliff edge and not visible. It is 65 feet down from the top and set back from the edge. but the concrete path that descends to it begins at a point that is visible from the southwest window when the lamp sweeps in that direction. Each time the beam passes, that section of clifftop is briefly illuminated, the concrete path beginning its descent, the iron stanchions of the safety railing, the top edge of the cliff beyond. Then the beam moves on and the clifftop is dark again. On a night watch, Guy learns the terrain around the lighthouse by this rhythmic illumination. You see the clifftop for a fraction of a second. Then you see it again. Then again. Each time the same. The detail building up through repetition into something that feels continuous even though it is not. If you are standing watch and something on that clifftop changes between one illumination and the next, you will see it. You will have perhaps a second when the beam returns to determine what has changed. Marshall was standing watch on the night of the 14th. All three men were in the watchroom. Whatever they were watching, whatever kept them all awake, the lamp swept past it, or through it, or over it. At regular intervals, the sea around the Flannan Isles at night, in clear weather, is extraordinarily dark. There is no ambient light here, no town, no harbour, no fishing vessel in these waters at this season. The only light is the lighthouse itself, and the lighthouse illuminates the sea in sweeping arcs, each arc lasting a fraction of a second, and between each arc there is darkness. The swell is always there. You can hear it against the base of the cliff, a slow rhythmic percussion that is completely unlike the storm surf of the 14th. And when the lamp sweeps across the water, you can see its surface for a moment, dark and moving, the swell visible as a slow undulation, and then dark again. The sea at night in this location has a particular quality of depth, not metaphorical depth, actual depth. The water here goes down a long way, the continental shelf dropping steeply to the west, and you can feel the mass of it somehow. Standing in the watchroom, even through the glass and the stone and the mechanism turning, the men who stood watch here knew this feeling. They would have named it differently than depth. They would have said it was the Atlantic, and meant by that something about scale, about the relationship between the lighthouse and the water, between the light and the dark, between what the lamp reached. A lighthouse keeper on night watch is trained to maintain a particular kind of attention, present, observant, not ruminative. You scan the sea for vessels, especially in poor visibility. You monitor the machinery. You record the weather at the appointed intervals. You wind the weight when it is time to wind it. You do not sit in the dark and follow trains of thought wherever they lead, because a train keeper knows that the dark and the isolation and the repetitive rhythm of the mechanism can lead thought into places that are not useful. This is not suppression of imagination. It is professional discipline, the same kind of discipline that allows a surgeon to operate without dwelling on what each cut means. Duckett had practiced this discipline for 20 years. He was good at it, by all accounts. Marshall had 7 years of it. On the 14th of December, Marshall records in the log that Duckett was crying, a man with 20 years of lighthouse discipline, weeping in the watchroom. This is not the response of a man who has seen a large wave damage a landing platform. This is the response of a man who has encountered something that his discipline, his training, his 2 decades of professional experience in difficult and isolated places has provided him no framework for. Something that did not fit, something for which there is a kind of fear that experienced people do not easily show, and when they show it, it means something. MacArthur's fear, expressed through persistent prayer, is understandable in the context of a newer keeper in difficult conditions. But Duckett's and Marshall's fear is different in kind. These are men who have been afraid before. They have been on rock stations in Force 10 storms. They have managed machinery failure in the dark. They have been responsible for maintaining a light that ships depend on in conditions that would incapacitate most people. They know what fear is, and they have developed, through experience, a working relationship with it. They can function through it, around it, despite it. What they apparently cannot function through is whatever the watch room showed them on those 3 days in December. Duckett goes quiet. Then he weeps. MacArthur prays continuously. Marshall records it all and keeps the log and winds the weight and does not say what he himself is feeling. And then on the 15th, 5 words. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. And after that, nothing. The log is there, open on the table, in the watch room, in the lighthouse that is still running. The longest hours of the night watch are the ones before dawn. Not because they are darker. The darkness is consistent all night, but because the mind knows, by some internal clock, that morning should be coming and is not yet here. Between 4 in the morning and the first usable light, there is a stretch of time that moves differently from the hours that precede it. The lamp turns, the weight descends, the sea moves against the rock below. You have been in the watch room for hours. You have watched the clifftop at the southwest each time the lamp passes. You have heard the sea doing what the sea does. The clock on the shelf reads 8 minutes past 9, except that it has stopped and has been stopped for 11 days and does not in fact tell you what time it is. The clock reads 8 minutes past 9 because something stopped it on a day in December. Something that happened in this room or near it. And no one has touched it since because there was no one here to touch it. And now you are here and you have read it and you know what it says, and the lamp goes on turning and the night goes on, and in the morning the Hesperus will come and you will have answers. Or you will have the same facts arranged in slightly more order. And either way the island will be the same. Present. Quiet. The formal record closes in January of 1901. Robert Muirhead, Superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, submits his report to the commissioners. It is a thorough document, detailed, careful, professionally written. It examines the physical evidence at the West Landing, the condition of the lighthouse interior, the log entries, the accounts of Mòr and Harvey and the crew of the Hesperus. It considers and rejects a number of alternative explanations: foul play by an unknown vessel, an accident within the lighthouse itself, a dispute among the keepers. It arrives at its conclusion. The men were lost at sea, overwhelmed by an exceptional wave or waves at the West Landing. Muirhead does not characterize this conclusion as certain. He uses the phrase most probably, and the phrase consistent with the available evidence, and the phrase no other explanation satisfies all the known facts, which is both true and slightly different from saying that his explanation satisfies all of them. It is the best available conclusion. It is the one the official record adopts. The file is marked closed. The lighthouse continues. The Northern Lighthouse Board updates its safety procedures and moves on. The sea, which keeps its own records and does not share them. Robert Muirhead spent 2 days on Eilean Mòr in January of 1901. He walked the same paths Mòr walked. He read the same log. He stood on the West Landing platform and looked at the sea and at the bent railing and at the place where the equipment box had been. He examined the kitchen, the watch room, the hook where MacArthur's oilskin still hung. He did his job thoroughly and professionally and submitted a report that says what official reports are required to say. Here are the facts. Here is the most supportable interpretation. Here is the conclusion. The report does not include personal observations. It was not that kind of document. But a letter exists, written by Meerhead to a colleague at the board in February of that year, in which he describes the visit in passing. The letter is largely administrative, a discussion of safety procedure updates, the appointment of replacement keepers, the procurement of replacement equipment for the West Landing. Near the end, in a single sentence that has no particular lead-up and no follow-on, Meerhead writes, "I was glad to leave the island. That is all." He moves immediately to the next administrative matter. But the sentence is there. A measured, experienced man who did not deal in unnecessary feeling, writing a sentence that implies the island produced in him something he a century and more of investigation, speculation. An analysis has produced a substantial body of theories about the Flannan Isles' disappearance, ranging from the scrupulously evidenced to the elaborately fanciful. The rogue wave theory, supported by physical evidence at the West Landing, consistent with the log entries' description of severe weather, undermined by the absence of storm records from other stations. A seismic event or submarine disturbance, possible in these geologically active waters, no evidence. An attack by an unknown vessel has no evidence whatsoever and is not taken seriously by anyone familiar with the material. Gas emanation from the sea floor, inducing hallucination or incapacitation, theoretically possible. No evidence specific to this location. Something in the physical behavior of the island itself, the particular way the Flannans interact with swell and current and deep water wave trains, producing conditions that are not replicated elsewhere and not predictable from conditions elsewhere. This is the most scientifically minded version of what the fishermen said when they called the place the other country. Not supernatural, not beyond physics, simply beyond the physics that the Victorians, and perhaps we, fully understand. The island is anomalous in some way. 3 men encountered the anomaly. The anomaly has a name, which is Eilean Mòr, and the Eilean Mòr lighthouse was automated in 1971. The last keepers left the island that year, taking with them the tradition of human habitation that had persisted continuously since the lighthouse was first commissioned in 1899. The lamp was converted to electric power. A timer was installed to control its operation. Maintenance visits from the Northern Lighthouse Board reduced from the continuous rotation of the keeper system to occasional inspections as needed. The light still burns. It is a modern LED array now, inside the original lens, turning at the same character, one flash every 30 seconds, that it has always had. Ships still use it. The light still marks the passage between the island and the open Atlantic, the same passage it has marked for 126 years. The island itself is accessible to visitors during certain seasons. Seabird researchers, the occasional organized tour, people who simply want to see the place. They can walk the path from the East Landing, enter the lighthouse compound, look at the tower and the outbuildings and the watch room where Marshall wrote. The West Landing is still there, the railing long since replaced, the equipment box in its restored socket. The cliff is the same cliff. The sea is the same sea. The island, as it always has. James Duckett was 53 years old when he disappeared. He had a wife and 4 children on the mainland. He had served the Northern Lighthouse Board for 20 years with what every record describes as complete reliability and professionalism. He had perhaps another 10 or 15 years of service ahead of him, and then retirement, and an old age with the family he had spent his career partly separated from. Thomas Marshall was 39. He had 7 years of service, a similar pattern of postings, a similar private life on the mainland that intersected with his lighthouse career only between rotations. Donald MacArthur was 40, an occasional keeper, brought in to fill a gap, not a man of long experience. He had been on Eilean Mòr for 6 weeks. He had complained of the cold and was not suited to rock station work. By Marshall's account, all 3 of them are gone and the sea has kept them. And the island that was their last posting is still there, operational, maintained, emitting its regular signal across the water as though nothing happened here, as though the gap in the log was simply a gap, unremarkable, awaiting the next entry that will not come. Their names are in the record. The light on Eilean Mòr does not know the history of the island. A light does not know anything. It turns because the mechanism turns it, and the mechanism turns because it is maintained, and it is maintained because ships need it, and ships need it because the sea around the Flannan Isles has taken ships without it and will take them again. The light is functional. It serves a purpose. It has served that purpose every night since December of 1899, with one interruption of 11 days in the winter of 1900, when the mechanism wound nearly down and a young man named Joseph Moore arrived on a relief tender and found the island empty and climbed the tower and wound the weight and kept the light going. That is the chain of custody. 126 years of hands winding the weight, tending the mechanism, recording the weather, rotating the keepers, updating the technology, maintaining the light. And behind all of that, behind the continuous maintenance and the reasonable explanations and the closed official file, there are 3 men who are not accounted for in any way that fully satisfies. The light sweeps the water receives it, the dark closes in behind, and the island, the other country, the place the fishermen still approach with a portion of their catch held ready to let slip back into the sea. The island keeps what it keeps and offers nothing back, and the light goes on without them, tonight as it has every night, regular and indifferent and present, out across the Atlantic